Thank you. I just begin, and I'm so sorry that mein Deutsch ist terrible. Und ich kann nicht in Deutsch sprechen. What you need to understand is that I grew up in a household when I would visit my grandparents in Paris. If they didn't want me and my brother to understand what they were saying, they would speak in German. So for me, German is the language of secrets and confidences. I just want to pause before I answer your question and remind ourselves sort of how remarkable it is that I'm sitting here today in this context. And I'm realizing, I know Berlin and Germany well. I spend a lot of time here. I feel incredibly comfortable and good in Germany. That itself is remarkable. Because I grew up in a household where we were not allowed to buy anything German. So the change in the space of a generation and a half, I think, is a remarkable thing. And just before I answer your question, I do want to say it's incredibly nice being here at your invitation. I thank you for that. I want to thank my wonderful publisher, Nina, who's sitting somewhere, but I've lost track with exactly where she's sitting. It's a really big moment for me and for my family and for this broader story to find this book published in German, and I want to express a deep appreciation for that. It is not something I take for granted. I want to thank a number of friends, Katja, who's become a very dear friend. Some of you may come to the performance we're doing at the Concert House tomorrow night. I have my wonderful assistant, Leah, Mein Klinks and her family here. I have the wonderful Kiselhan family, who I've come to know so well over the last 3 or 4 years. And perhaps most curiously of all, and most wonderfully of all, I have my very dear friend, Nicholas Frank, who is here today. And that is incredibly significant for me, that Nicholas, who would have thought that the grandchild of someone who went through what he went through could, with his hand on his heart, say, the son of the man who did so much ill to my grandfather's family is my friend, and he is truly my friend in a deep way, as I've come to know him. It's fantastic that you're here. Nicholas, I know you'll hate that I'm saying this, but I feel I have to say it. It's really a mark of how much is possible to change over the period of 70 years. And so to your question. So in 2010, I was, and still am, a university professor at the University of London and a barrister who does a lot of cases before international courts, including on international crimes. That spring, I received an invitation to give a lecture on crimes against humanity and genocide in the obscure Ukrainian city of Lviv. I did not even know where it was. I didn't immediately realize that it was the same place as Lvov, Leopolis, and what our German-speaking friends call Lemberg. And I accepted, not because I wanted to give a lecture, but because I wanted to find the house in which my grandfather was born, in that city in 1904. I knew him very well. He lived until 1998, but he never once talked to me about anything that happened before 1945. It wasn't that I asked and he said no. It was that we grew up in an environment where you don't talk about these things. And so my brother and I learnt never to ask. And I know from the work that I do in other parts of the world, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Guantanamo, northern Iraq, Syria, the work that I've been doing with Dr. Kiselhan and some of his extraordinary patients, that there's a similar, it's not a particular to that terrible story, that it's a consequence of people who've been through traumatic experiences, both on the sides of victims and perpetrators, a sort of protective, embarrassed, shameful silence. And in a sense, the book that emerged was never intended to be written. I didn't go to Lviv, Lemberg, expecting to write a book. I went to find out. By extraordinary coincidence, I learnt that the man who invented the concept of crimes against humanity, Hersch Lauterpacht, who you mentioned, and the man who invented the concept of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, as recently as 44, 45, both were from Lviv, both went to the law school that had invited me, and the people who invited me didn't realize that the origins of crimes against humanity and genocide started in their own law school. It was like a little miracle. And it's, in a sense, a book of coincidences. And so I came back with a stronger sense of my own identity, because all of a sudden I'd opened a door, and because I'm a courtroom litigator, once you've opened doors, you don't stop. You just are in a space, and you find 4 more doors, and you open each of those doors, and you find 4 more spaces, and eventually you're on a journey that leads to places, and you don't know where you're going to end up. And one of the things that I didn't realize, of course, when I started writing a book 6 months later about 3 men, Leon, Lauterpacht, and Lemkin, was that a 4th man would come into the story, a man who's very connected with this building, although, as you say, he wasn't present on that day in January 1942, but his representatives were, and that's Hans Frank. And I learned, again, by accident, not because of any particular skill or dedication or anything, that he had come to Lviv, Lemberg, on the 1st of August 1942, and became, through the words he spoke and the actions he became associated with, a connector to the other 3 men. Each of the other 3 men lost pretty much their entire families because of, amongst others, his actions. He was not alone, but there were others, but he played a very central role. And so it becomes the story of the 4 men. And then you go forward a few years, and remarkably, the 2 lawyers who invented crimes against humanity and genocide find themselves prosecuting the 4th man, who is a defendant in the dock. I mean, you literally couldn't invent the story. But they don't know, on the day the trial opens, on the 20th of November 1945, that the man they are prosecuting is connected to the fate of their own families. So I have stumbled across this story, which I want to say at the outset, I think, is not a story about Germans and Jews. It's partly that, but it's not just a story, or Germans and Jews and Poles and Ukrainians. It's a universal story. It's about identity, and it's about silence. And one of the things that has really struck me as I've gone around the world talking about the book, in South Africa, in Mexico, in India, in Ireland, the story resonates for each community because everyone's got their analogous stories of identity and silence. In Ireland, where I did an event and 500 people turned up, I was just astonished. And the amazing thing about Ireland is when you go to an event, nowhere else does this, everyone buys a book. So you then spend 3 hours signing literally 400 copies, because Irish are very, very big readers. It's amazing, Ireland. What was the resonance in Ireland? The resonance in Ireland, we know your story, because we have our story. Our story, for example, is the Catholic Church, paedophilia, priests, silence, on a mass scale, and no one wants to talk about it. And I realized that essentially at the heart of this book is a story that touches each of us in this room in different ways, because it's about our identity. It's about who are we. Do we see ourselves primarily as individuals or as members of a group? How do we want to be protected? As individuals or as members of a group? How should the law protect us? Should it, as Lauterpacht believe, protect us because each of us in this room has qualities as a human being, as an individual that are worthy of protection, the Lauterpact model, or should the law protect us on the Lemkin model, because, as Lemkin observes correctly, people tend not to be killed in large numbers because of what they've done individually, but because they are a member of a group that happens to be hated at a particular moment in time and in place. And Lemkin says of Lauterpact's thesis, no, it's all very well having individual human rights and protection of the individual, but actually what we need to do is protect the group. Says Lauterpact, the problem with that analysis is you will replace the tyranny of the state with the tyranny of groups. And that is the fundamental tension and contradiction. So it's a very personal and accidental story.
Yeah, maybe after this beginning, I would like to hand over to you, Katja, to read us a piece from the book, which starts in the courtroom in Nuremberg. And then we will come back with Philippe.
Es geht, glaube ich, so. Ich lese in Deutsch und eigentlich ungefähr das, was Philippe gerade schon erzählt hat. Insofern geht das, glaube ich, ganz gut zusammen. Eine Einladung. Dienstag, 1. Oktober 1946, Justizpalast in Nürnberg. Kurz nach 15 Uhr öffnete sich die Holztür hinter der Anklagebank und Hans Frank betrat den Gerichtssaal 600. Er trug einen grauen Anzug, dessen Farbe sich vom Weiß der Helme zweier ernst blickender Militärpolizisten abhob, die ihn begleiteten. Die Gerichtsverhandlungen hatten ihren Tribut gefordert von dem Mann, der Adolf Hitlers persönlicher Anwalt und dann sein Statthalter im von Deutschland besetzten Polen gewesen war. Einem Mann mit rosigen Wangen, einer scharfen kleinen Nase und straff zurückgekämmtem Haar. Frank war nicht mehr der fesche, schlanke Minister, als den ihn sein Freund Richard Strauss gefeiert hatte. Tatsächlich befand er sich in einem Zustand beträchtlicher Verwirrung, und zwar so sehr, dass er sich nach Betreten des Raumes in die falsche Richtung drehte und den Richtern den Rücken zukehrte. In dem vollen Gerichtssaal saß an diesem Tag ein Professor für internationales Recht an der Universität Cambridge, Hersch Lauterpacht. Mit schütterem Haar und Brille hockte rund wie eine Eule am Ende eines langen Holztisches, eingerahmt von angesehenen Kollegen aus dem Team der britischen Anklagevertretung. Lauterpacht, der in seinem schwarzen Anzug nur wenige Schritte von Frank entfernt saß, war derjenige, der die Idee gehabt hatte, den Begriff Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit in das Nürnberger Statut einzubringen. 4 Wörter, um die Ermordung von 4 Millionen Juden und Polen auf polnischem Territorium zu beschreiben. Lauterpacht sollte später einmal als der bedeutendste Völkerrechtler des 20. Jahrhunderts und als ein Vater der modernen Menschenrechtsbewegung gelten. Doch sein Interesse an Frank war nicht nur beruflicher Natur. 5 Jahre lang war Frank Gouverneur eines Gebiets gewesen, zu dem auch Lemberg gehörte, die Heimat von Lauterpachts großer Familie. Darunter seine Eltern, ein Bruder, eine Schwester und deren Kinder. Als der Prozess 1 Jahr zuvor eröffnet worden war, war über ihr Schicksal im Reich des Hans Frank nichts bekannt. Ein anderer Mann, der sich für den Prozess interessierte, war an diesem Tag nicht anwesend. Raphael Lemkin lag in einem amerikanischen Militärkrankenhaus in Paris im Bett und hörte sich das Urteil im Radio an. Er war Staatsanwalt und Rechtsanwalt in Warschau gewesen. 1939 bei Ausbruch des Krieges aus Polen geflohen und schließlich in Amerika gelandet. Dort arbeitete er für die amerikanische Anklagevertretung des Prozesses, Seite an Seite mit den Briten. Auf seiner langen Flucht führte er eine Reihe von Handkoffern mit sich. vollgestopft mit Dokumenten, darunter viele von Frank unterzeichnete Erlasse. Beim Studium dieser Unterlagen in Amerika entdeckte Lemkin ein Verhaltensmuster, das er mit einem Etikett versah, um das Verbrechen zu beschreiben, dessen Frank angeklagt werden konnte. Er nannte es Genozid. Während Lauterpacht sich auf Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit konzentrierte und somit auf den Schutz von Individuen, ging es ihm um den Schutz ganzer Bevölkerungsgruppen. Er hatte unermüdlich dafür gearbeitet, Frank des Genozids anklagen zu können. Aber an diesem letzten Prozesstag war er zu krank, um dabei zu sein. Auch er hatte ein persönliches Interesse an Frank. Er hatte jahrelang in Lwow gewohnt und seine Eltern und sein Bruder waren von den Verbrechen betroffen, die auf Franks Gebiet begangen worden sein sollten. Angeklagter Hans Frank, verkündete der Gerichtspräsident. Frank sollte nun erfahren, ob er zu Weihnachten noch am Leben und in der Lage sein würde, das Versprechen einzulösen, das er kürzlich seinem 7-jährigen Sohn gegeben hatte. Dass alles gut war und er zum Fest zu Hause sein würde. Donnerstag, 16. Oktober 2014. Justizpalast in Nürnberg. 68 Jahre später besuchte ich den Gerichtssaal 600 in Begleitung von Hans Franks Sohn Niklas, der ein kleiner Junge gewesen war, als sein Vater ihm dieses Versprechen gegeben hatte. Niklas und ich begannen unseren Besuch in dem trostlosen, leeren Flügel des nicht mehr genutzten Gefängnisses hinter dem Justizpalast, dem einzigen der 4 Flügel, der noch stand. Wir saßen gemeinsam in einer kleinen Zelle, ähnlich der, in der sein Vater fast ein Jahr verbracht hatte. Zum letzten Mal war Niklas im September 1946 in diesem Gebäudeteil gewesen. Es ist der einzige Raum auf der Welt, wo ich meinem Vater ein klein wenig näher bin, sagte er zu mir. Wenn ich hier sitze und an ihn denke, wie er ungefähr ein Jahr lang hier drin gewesen ist, mit einer offenen Toilette, einem kleinen Tisch und Bett, sonst nichts. Die Zelle war gnadenlos. Und das war auch Niklas, im Hinblick auf die Taten seines Vaters. Mein Vater war Rechtsanwalt. Er wusste, was er tat. Der Gerichtssaal 600, der immer noch benutzt wird, hatte sich seit der Zeit des Prozesses nicht wesentlich verändert. Damals, im Jahr 1946, musste jeder der 21 Angeklagten auf dem Weg von den Zellen in den Gerichtssaal einen engen Fahrstuhl benutzen. Eine Vorrichtung, die Niklas und ich sehen wollten. Sie war noch vorhanden, hinter der Bank, auf der die Angeklagten saßen. Man betrat den Fahrstuhl durch eine alte Holztür, die sich so geräuschlos öffnete wie je. Auf zu, schrieb R.W. Cooper von The Times in London, der täglich über den Prozess berichtete. Niklas ließ die Tür aufgleiten, betrat den engen Raum und schloss dann die Tür hinter sich. Als er wieder herauskam, ging er zu dem Platz, auf dem sein Vater während des Prozesses gesessen hatte, in dem er wegen Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit und Genozids angeklagt worden war. Niklas setzte sich und stützte sich vorn auf das Holzgeländer. Er sah mich an, blickte sich im Saal um und seufzte dann. Ich hatte mir oft Gedanken gemacht über den Augenblick, als sein Vater das letzte Mal durch die Tür des Aufzugs getreten und zur Anklagebank gegangen war. Es existiert kein Filmmaterial, denn am letzten Nachmittag des Prozesses, am Dienstag, dem 1. Oktober 1946, durfte nicht gefilmt werden. Das geschah, um die Würde der Angeklagten zu wahren. Niklas' Stimme unterbrach meine Gedanken. Er sprach leise und bestimmt. Das ist ein glücklicher Raum, für mich und für die Welt. Dass Niklas und ich uns gemeinsam im Gerichtssaal 600 befanden, verdankte sich einer überraschenden Einladung, die ich einige Jahre zuvor erhalten hatte. Sie stammte von der juristischen Fakultät der Universität jener Stadt, die heute unter dem Namen Lviv bekannt ist. Man lud mich ein, einen öffentlichen Vortrag über meine Arbeit zu halten, die sich um Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit und Genozid dreht. Die Fakultät bat mich, über die Fälle zu berichten, an denen ich beteiligt gewesen war, sowie über meine Forschung zum Nürnberger Kriegsverbrecherprozess und dessen Folgen für unsere heutige Welt. Sehr wahrscheinlich hatte ich die Einladung aus Lviv eher meiner Arbeit als Anwalt zu verdanken als meinen Büchern. Im Sommer 98 war ich am Rande an den Verhandlungen in Rom beteiligt, die zur Schaffung des Internationalen Strafgerichtshofs führten, und einige Monate später arbeitete ich am Pinochet-Fall in London mit. Der frühere Präsident Chiles, der von einem spanischen Staatsanwalt wegen Genozids und Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit angeklagt worden war, hatte sich vor britischen Gerichten auf Immunität berufen und war gescheitert. In den Jahren danach sorgten andere Fälle dafür, dass sich die Pforten der internationalen Strafjustiz nach einer Periode des Stillstands während des Kalten Krieges, der auf den Nürnberger Prozess folgte, allmählich wieder öffneten. Fälle aus dem früheren Jugoslawien und aus Ruanda landeten bald auf meinem Schreibtisch in London. Es folgten Fälle aus dem Kongo, aus Libyen, Afghanistan und Tschetschenien, aus dem Iran, Syrien und dem Libanon, aus Sierra Leone, Guantanamo und dem Irak. Die lange traurige Liste zeigte deutlich, dass die guten Absichten aus dem Gerichtssaal 600 in Nürnberg erfolglos geblieben waren. Ich bekam es mit mehreren Fällen von Massenmord zu tun. Einige wurden als Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit, die Tötung einzelner Menschen im großen Maßstab behandelt, und andere führten zur Anklage wegen Genozids, der gezielten Vernichtung von nationalen, ethnischen, rassischen oder religiösen Bevölkerungsgruppen. Diese zwei unterschiedlichen Straftatbestände mit ihren jeweiligen Schwerpunkten auf dem Individuum und der Gruppe entwickelten sich parallel. Doch im Laufe der Zeit erschien vielen Menschen der Genozid als das Verbrechen aller Verbrechen. Ganz so, als gäbe es eine interne Rangfolge und als wäre es weniger schrecklich, eine große Anzahl von Individuen zu töten. Gelegentlich erhielt ich Hinweise auf die Herkunft und den Zweck der beiden Begriffe sowie auf ihren Zusammenhang mit den Verhandlungen im Gerichtssaal 600. Doch stellte ich nie allzu gründliche Nachforschungen darüber an, was in Nürnberg geschehen war. Ich wusste, wie diese neuen Straftatbestände entstanden waren und wie sie sich später entwickelt hatten. Doch ich wusste wenig über die damit verbundenen persönlichen Geschichten oder wie es dazu kam, dass die beiden Verbrechen im Strafverfahren gegen Hans Frank zur Anklage kamen. Auch über die persönlichen Umstände, unter denen Herr Schlauterpacht und Raphael Lemkin ihre unterschiedlichen Ideen entwickelten, wusste ich nichts. Die Einladung aus Lviv bot eine Chance, diese Geschichte zu erforschen. Soll ich nicht erstmal hier aufhören? Ich habe noch mehr, I have more, but I mean, it's a good, I think maybe you should talk a bit.
Yeah, I think this gave you a good introduction into it and sort of also repeated what you have already started to talk about. I would be very interested, as we are both lawyers, and how did you as a lawyer come to do human rights law, and what did this research on your book, on your family, on perpetrators, on Hans Frank, but also on the early attempts to document and also to basically legiferate on what had happened, what has become known as the Holocaust. What did this do to you? And how did, I mean, also if we are looking at these gentlemen there on the wall, out of the 15, 10 are lawyers. Most of them hold a PhD. We have, when we look at the Wannsee-Konferenz, we have legislation which accompanies the deportation process, at least from Western Europe. Is this the bankruptcy of the law we are looking at?
It just seems incredible, doesn't it, 10 of them, I didn't realize 10 of them had PhDs in law. I mean, I knew there were a lot of lawyers. So how did these things happen? Who knows why we end up doing, each of us, what we do? I've obviously come to the conclusion that what I do today must have a connection to what happened to my grandfather's family. But it was not articulated ever in those terms. So I became accidentally a lawyer. I went to university when I was 18, to Cambridge, to study economics. And I'd had a fantastic economics teacher at school. He was everyone needs just one teacher who inspires them, and mine was my economics teacher, whose name actually was Edmund Burke. And when I got to university, we had done more at school than we were going to do in the year ahead. So I thought, oh, this is really boring. I'll change to something else. And I changed to law. And I didn't like doing law at all, and I wasn't very good at it in the first year, especially real law subjects like contracts and torts and land law, ghastly. And then in my second year, I had a course with a man from Yorkshire called Robbie Jennings, who went on to become the British judge at the International Court and a very famous international lawyer. And he taught us international law. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. This is about the world, and it literally happened like that.
Not the nitty-gritty contract.
No. And then I stayed on for an extra year and did a master's specializing in international law. And then I went off to America to spend a year as a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, but actually was really about following someone I'd fallen in love with to go and spend a year in Boston, which is the real reason that I went. And while I was there, and I remember the day well, living above a poetry bookshop on Grolier Street, the Grolier Poetry Bookshop in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a letter arrived from my teacher at Cambridge University, Elie Lauterpacht, the son of Hirsch. Although at that point, at the age of 23, I knew Hirsch Lauterpacht was a famous international lawyer, but I knew nothing about him. So Elie writes to me and says, "You did well in your exams. I'm setting up a new research center for international law at Cambridge University. Would you like to apply for the position of research fellow for 4 years?" I applied, I got the position, and I started working at the research center, which was newly founded, and working with Elie Lauterpacht. 1984, it was only in 2014. So Elie he was my teacher. He then becomes my mentor. We then do cases together. He's the one who says, oh, and you must become a barrister also. And I do cases with him. I do cases against him. We teach together. We know each other for 30 years before, in 2014, in the research for this book, I discover that his father, Hirsch Lauterpacht, and my great-grandmother, Amalia Flaschner, came not only from the same region of the world, not only from the same town, Żółkiew, but from the same street, Lemberger Straße, which Joseph Roth called East-West Street, which is the name in the English version, which doesn't work in German. We can talk about that later. So, how amazing is that? How does that happen? But to carry on the story, I didn't do human rights with Elie. Elie was sort of not interested in human rights, curiously enough. And Elie never talked about his father, and never talked about what his father had done at Nuremberg. I later learned because his father never spoke to his son a single word about his role in the Nuremberg trial. So painful was the trial, it seems, for his father. And Hirsch Lauterpacht was not just anybody. Hirsch Lauterpacht wrote the closing speech for the British Attorney General, the Minister of Justice, in the trial. So he was at the top of the top table, and he never talks about it to his son. So I do other areas of law, and I happen to be doing law when the Chernobyl accident happens, and I start getting interested in that. And I start then doing work on environmental issues, and I then get involved in a case on nuclear weapons at the International Court of Justice in 1995, 1996, and I've still really not done any human rights by this point at all. And I'm working for a group of tiny Pacific Island states, Solomon Islands, Samoa, Marshall Islands, Micronesia. Probably no one has been to any of those countries. Which one?
Until 1940.
Which one?
Samoa.
Samoa. Gosh, I didn't know. Oh my God, I didn't. So there you are. There's a subconscious something is going on. And then that finishes, and then Solomon Islands and Samoa say, oh, we care about this thing called the International Criminal Court, and would you go and represent us in Rome to negotiate the statute? Would you join our team and be our legal advisor? So I go off to Rome in July 1998. It's literally as accidental as all that. And while I'm in Rome, and we were given, I worked with my colleague Andrew Clapham, who now teaches the Graduate Institute in Geneva, because they needed to find something for these little countries to do, they gave to these little countries the drafting of the preamble of the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. And so Andrew and I drafted the preamble, and no one changed anything. We were sort of amazed that we could do this, and we put some things in it which were quite progressive, and no one took them out, and so they became part of international law accidentally. But in the course of the representation, at one point I was asked to join a working group on the rights of victims in the Rome Statute. There is a special provision on the rights of victims to participate in international proceedings, which was new and revolutionary. And I, by this point, being in the English legal tradition, am inherently conservative. Anything new is basically to be avoided, if it possibly can, unless there are good reasons. In a positive way, but it's just, if we haven't done it before, we shouldn't start doing it now. And I find myself in a conversation with, ironically enough, for those of you who've read the book and know my own family background, the delegate of Austria. And I'm sort of saying, it seems incredible now, but I'm being honest here, why do we need special provisions for the rights of victims? Which, I see Jan in the background, he knows I care passionately today about the rights of victims. But I'm saying, show me another provision in any international statute. At Nuremberg, the victims didn't have a voice. In Rwanda and Yugoslavia, there's no provision. So why are we putting in this new provision? And I remember the Austrian delegate got very upset with me and said to me, you're against the rights of victims. And as Austria, we are totally in favor of the rights of victims. And at that point, I thought, hang on, this is really weird. Cannot be right. I need to reflect on what's actually going on here. And I think that was the moment. And 1998, by complete coincidence, was a dramatic year, because apart from the Rome Statute, Senator Pinochet was arrested in London on the 16th of October, 1998, and 3 days later, I got called up by his lawyers and asked to represent Senator Pinochet. And in the English legal tradition, as a barrister, we have something called the cab rank principle, the taxi driver principle. You are like a taxi driver. Someone puts their hand up and wants to hire you, you can't say, oh, I don't like your case, you just do it. And so from my legal training, you act for Pinochet. Because your role is not to promote the interests of Pinochet, but to promote the interests of the rule of law and the justice system, so that the judges who decide the case get the best possible legal arguments. And the day that I got that approach by Pinochet, it's a long answer to your question, but it gives you a sense of the reality of human existence and how we accidentally do what we do. I go to the stone setting of my grandfather, Leon, in Paris. In the Jewish tradition, a year after someone dies or thereabouts, then you put the gravestone. And it happened to be the same day that I'm approached by Pinochet. And I arrive at the cemetery in Paris, and my wonderful wife, Natalia, is there. And I say to her, rather excited, oh, guess what? The Pinochet lawyers have been in touch. They want me to act. for Pinochet. Because in the English tradition, that's someone instructs you, you do it. And it's an interesting and important case. And she looks at me and she says, you act for Pinochet, I will divorce you. Okay? I will divorce you. Literally, she says that. Why? Because she comes from a family in Spain, on her mother's side, where they were Republicans. And Pinochet is the devil. And still the family today is divided in her family, her Spanish family, between the Republicans and the Nationalists. It's really interesting. Still today, 70 years later, 80 years later. And she just said, I'm sorry, it's just unacceptable. And so, of course, I listened to my wife. And I find an excuse, which I am able to give plausibly, because I talked on a BBC radio show a couple of days earlier saying, well, you know, the rules should change. Why should anyone have immunity? Look at the Nuremberg whole story. And so I say no to the Pinochet lawyers. And the next day, Human Rights Watch get in touch and say, will you act against Pinochet? So I acted against Pinochet. And then, once you were involved in the Pinochet trial, then everything, it must have opened up something in my deep subconscious. And I started to really start thinking about these things. Something was unclenched. You know, I begin the book with a quote from Joseph Roth. I'll read it in English, you read it in German. Okay, I'll read it in English first. It's probably, I think, the most important quote in the whole book. It's by actually two Hungarian psychoanalysts, Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok, who examine the relationship between grandparent and grandchild, which is one of the themes that comes out of the book. What haunts are not the dead, but the gaps left within us by the secrets of others. And at the age of 38, something must have been unleashed in my relationship with my grandfather, is what I understand to have happened. How that happened, I do not know.
Nicht die Gestorbenen sind es, die uns heimsuchen, sondern die Lücken, die aufgrund von Geheimnissen anderer in uns zurückgeblieben sind. Nicholas Abraham, 75.
Yeah, that's the one which is working. So the basically the rescue of your marriage coincides with the rebirth, one has to say, of international criminal law after the Cold War comes to an end. But now we are at a different point, yeah. And you have been looking at this development in an earlier book, in Lawless World. You've been representing people from Guantanamo, which had no status. Yeah, they were enemy combatants. They were not prisoners of war. There were no criminal prisoners. So you are also witnessing in your professional career an erosion again of what seemed to have been a hopeful development at the beginning of the 1990s, and when the Rome Statute was adopted, when the ICC was created in The Hague. In a way, you must feel a little bit like Hersch Lauterpacht and Lemkin, who saw this window of opportunity opening in summer 1945, 1946, with the Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, the Genocide Convention on the 9th of December 1948. We are looking at 70 years here now. But we are at a sort of turning point where identity matters again very strongly. Ethnical identities matter very strongly. Politics go around identity to a much higher degree than what we would have expected a couple of years ago. And I would like to hear your comments on this.
No, I think it's absolutely right. We know, all of us, whether we're in Germany, Britain, the United States, or many other parts of the world, that something is happening now. There is something going on. What it is, how it is connected to things of the past is, I think, unclear. We cannot know. I think one must be very careful not to make assumptions that we're just going back to a previous period. But plainly there is something that is happening, and there's something that is happening in the context that the generation who remembers what Europe was capable of doing to itself is disappearing. And so we have, for the first time, I'm thinking in particular in Britain, where I think Brexit is in part of this, a generation of politicians who have no historical memory and who do not realize that what happened in 1945, the construction of an embryonic system to try to put in place safety mechanisms to stop these kinds of horrors from happening, was an absolutely significant revolutionary moment and is not to be taken for granted. In short, I mean, looking at it in a longer historical perspective, hundreds of years or thousands of years, what happened in 1945 was a huge revolution. For the first time in human history, the position was taken that the sovereignty of the sovereign, the sovereignty of the state, is not absolute. The sovereign's powers are limited by something called international law in terms of what they can and cannot do. I mean, as of 1935, for example, if a sovereign said everyone on this side of the room will be killed this afternoon at 6 p.m., international law had nothing to say about that. Well, that's what the sovereign wants to do. That's the right of the sovereign. And so what Lauterpacht, Lemkin, and others did, and states did in 1945, was say, no, that's finished. Those days are finished. Sovereignty is no longer absolute. And I think what we're seeing now, whether it's Make America Great Again or Brexit taking back control, is effectively saying the 1945 settlement doesn't suit us anymore. Now, I tend to be more on the optimistic side when you look at the totality of human history, in thinking that things go in ebbs and in flows, that this is a particular moment. It may be there will be a catastrophe, a real catastrophe again. I don't exclude that possibility at all. But that the track that was set in 1945 is the track that will eventually prevail. Because if you go back on human history, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step sideways, 1 step backwards, 2 more steps forward. There's a tendency, if you take the bigger picture, to build on what has come before rather than destroy completely what has come before. So I think we face an incredibly difficult moment. But I think there is a responsibility, and here I speak perhaps more as a parent of children coming into adult consciousness now. I don't think it's good enough for people like me to say, oh, we're going back to the 1930s, catastrophe is coming. I don't think that's good enough. I think it's much more complex than that. And actually, I think what is happening in certain countries, the UK and the US more than any, is disparities and inequalities in wealth and in well-being are provoking and catalyzing a sense that what's the point of globalization? What's the point of the European Union? What's the point? It's all miserable and we don't have jobs and the jobs we have are terrible. And so they are rejecting that, and there is no leadership in taking things forward. And curiously, if one looks at it in a different way, what are the 2 countries that did more than most to put in place the 1945 moment? The whole system, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Genocide Convention, United Nations Charter. It was Britain and the United States. And they've fallen off the table, basically, right now. In Britain, we don't have a government. We don't have a functioning government. It's just gone. It's just completely disappeared. And how ironic, and I know others in the room will disagree, but from London's perspective, Germany seems to be the bastion of liberal values, the rule of law.
We don't have a government yet.
and and we look in this curious way, and we look hopefully from London to Berlin, and hope that you'll sort us out of this mess that we've got ourselves into. But I think there's grounds for real concern, but I don't think we should panic, and I think we have a responsibility not to say, oh, we're going back to the 1930s and it's all going to happen again. I think it's much more complex and nuanced than that, but plainly there is an attack on the settlement of 1945.
On this optimistic note, I would hand over to Katja again to continue with the reading. Yeah.
Die Einladung aus Lviv bot eine Chance, diese Geschichte zu erforschen. Ich ergriff sie auch noch aus einem anderen Grund. Mein Großvater, Leon Buchholz, wurde dort geboren. Tschüss! Guten Flug! Tschüss! Mein Großvater Leon Buchholz wurde dort geboren. Ich kannte den Vater meiner Mutter viele Jahre lang. Er starb 1997 in Paris, einer Stadt, die er liebte und Heimat nannte. Doch ich wusste wenig über die Jahre vor 1945, weil er nicht über sie sprechen wollte. Sein Leben umspannte das gesamte 20. Jahrhundert und als ich ihn kennenlernte, war seine einstmals große Familie zusammengeschrumpft. Das begriff ich, aber nicht in welchem Ausmaß oder unter welchen Umständen. Eine Reise nach Lviv bot mir die Möglichkeit, mehr über jene schmerzlichen Jahre zu erfahren. Ein paar wenige Informationen hatte er preisgegeben, doch zum größten Teil hatte Leon die erste Hälfte seines Lebens in einer Gruft verschlossen. Die damaligen Ereignisse mussten in den Nachkriegsjahren große Auswirkungen auf meine Mutter gehabt haben. Doch sie waren auch für mich wichtig, hatten sie doch folgenreiche Spuren und viele unbeantwortete Fragen hinterlassen. Warum hatte ich mich für eine juristische Laufbahn entschieden? Und warum für ein juristisches Gebiet, das offenbar mit einer unausgesprochenen Familiengeschichte verbunden war? Nicht die Gestorbenen sind es, die uns heimsuchen, sondern die Lücken, die aufgrund von Geheimnissen anderer in uns zurückgeblieben sind, schrieb der Psychoanalytiker Nicholas Abraham über die Beziehungen zwischen Enkeln und Großeltern. Die Einladung nach Lviv war eine Möglichkeit, diese verstörenden Lücken zu erkunden. Ich nahm sie an und brachte dann einen Sommer damit zu, den Vortrag zu verfassen. Ich kam im Herbst 2010 nach Lviv, um meinen Vortrag zu halten. Inzwischen hatte ich eine merkwürdige und bisher offensichtlich unbemerkte Tatsache entdeckt. Die beiden Männer, die die Straftatbestände des Verbrechens gegen die Menschlichkeit und des Genozids in den Nürnberger Prozessen einführten, Herr Schlauterpacht und Raphael Lemkin, waren Einwohner dieser Stadt gewesen. Beide studierten an derselben Universität und durchlebten jene bitteren Jahre. Das sollte nicht der letzte von vielen Zufällen sein, die mir auf den Schreibtisch kamen, aber es blieb der entscheidendste. War es nicht erstaunlich, dass ich bei der Vorbereitung meiner Reise nach Lviv, wo ich über die Entstehung des Völkerstrafrechts sprechen sollte, erfuhr, dass die Stadt selbst eng mit dessen Entstehung verknüpft war. Es schien mir mehr als ein bloßer Zufall zu sein, dass die beiden Männer, die mehr als jeder andere zu unserem modernen System der internationalen Strafgerichtsbarkeit beigetragen hatten, aus eben dieser Stadt stammten. Ebenso bemerkenswert war, dass niemand, den ich im Lauf dieses ersten Besuchs an der Universität oder irgendwo in Lviv traf, etwas über die Rolle dieser Stadt dabei wusste. Die Fragen nach dem Vortrag bezogen sich meist auf das Leben der beiden Männer. In welchen Straßen hatten sie gewohnt? Welche Kurse hatten sie an der Universität belegt und wer waren ihre Lehrer gewesen? Waren sie sich begegnet oder hatten sie sich gekannt? Was war in den Jahren nach ihrem Weggang aus der Stadt geschehen? Warum sprach heute niemand an der juristischen Fakultät von ihnen? Warum konzentrierte der eine von ihnen sich auf den Schutz von Individuen und der andere auf den Schutz von Gruppen? Wie kam es, dass sie beim Nürnberger Prozess mitwirkten? Und was geschah mit ihren Familien? Ich hatte keine Antworten auf diese Fragen zu Lauterpacht und Lemkin. Dann stellte jemand eine Frage, die ich beantworten konnte. Was ist der Unterschied zwischen Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit und Genozid? Stellen Sie sich die Ermordung von 100.000 Menschen vor, die derselben Bevölkerungsgruppe angehören, erklärte ich. Juden oder Polen in der Stadt Lviv. Für Lauterpacht wäre die Ermordung von Individuen, wenn sie Teil eines systematischen Plans ist, ein Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit. Für Lemkin lag der Fokus auf Genozid, der Ermordung vieler Menschen mit der Absicht, die Gruppe auszulöschen, zu der sie gehören. Für einen heutigen Ankläger besteht der Unterschied zwischen beiden Straftatbeständen hauptsächlich darin, ob eine Absicht beweisbar sei. Um Genozid zu beweisen, muss man belegen, dass die Mordtaten in der Absicht begangen wurden, die Gruppe zu vernichten, während dies für Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit nicht nötig ist. Ich erklärte, dass es notorisch schwierig sei, eine entsprechende Absicht nachzuweisen, da die Beteiligten an solchen Morden nicht dazu neigten, Spuren in Gestalt von relevanten Unterlagen zu hinterlassen. Ob denn die Unterscheidung überhaupt eine Rolle spiele, fragte ein anderer. Spielt es eine Rolle, ob das Gesetz dich schützen will, weil du ein Individuum bist oder weil du zufällig zu einer Gruppe gehörst? Diese Frage stand im Raum und hat mich seither nicht losgelassen. Später am Abend trat eine Studentin an mich heran. Können wir privat sprechen miteinander außer Hörweite der anderen? Flüsterte sie. Es ist etwas Persönliches. Wir begaben uns in einer Ecke. Keiner in der Stadt kenne Lauterpacht und Lemkin oder mache sich etwas aus ihnen, sagte sie, weil sie Juden waren. Ihre Identität sei ihr Makel. Mag sein, antwortete ich, da ich nicht wusste, worauf sie hinaus wollte. Sie sagte, ich wollte, dass Sie wissen, wie wichtig Ihre Vorlesung für mich gewesen ist. Persönlich wichtig. Ich verstand, was sie mir mitteilen wollte und dass sie mir einen Hinweis auf ihre eigenen Wurzeln gab. Ob Polin oder Jüdin, darüber konnte man nicht offen sprechen. Fragen der individuellen Identität und Gruppenzugehörigkeit waren in Lviv heikel. Ich habe ihr Interesse an Lauterpacht und Lemkin verstanden, fuhr sie fort. Aber ist nicht Ihr Großvater derjenige, dessen Spuren Sie verfolgen sollten? Ist er Ihrem Herzen nicht am nächsten?
Ja, herzlichen Dank. We both went to Lviv and we all did, yeah. Unfortunately, the title City of Ghosts has already been distributed for another city, for Thessaloniki, and Mark Mazauer's book, who also wrote a book about his grandfather and his family. It would actually be good to have the two of you together. Yeah. But there's one sort of hero we haven't talked about in your book. This is Miss Tilney. Miss Tilney is quite an interesting figure, and she's linked to this traumatic event, which must have been for your mother something very coining for her life. The fact that she had been given away by her own mother to a stranger, to this Miss Tilney, in order to be brought to Paris, which probably saved her life. Would you like to briefly talk about her? Because she's also a sign of optimism and hope in your book.
I mean, my mother, of course, had no idea who Miss Tilney was and didn't even know that Miss Tilney was the lady who had saved her life. So this is a book written by someone who spends a lot of time in courtrooms and who has learned that tiny details really matter and that nothing is ever quite what it seems. When I got the invitation to go to Lviv, I asked my mother, are there any papers of my grandparents that I haven't seen? What I really wanted was to find the address of the house. And she said, actually there are, I've never shown them to you. Would you like to see them? I said, yes. She goes and gets these two tatty old briefcases that are absolutely full of papers. And I love paper and words and documents. I really do. I'm never happier than when I'm with old bits of paper because you find amazing things, always. And I sat on the floor of her living room just spreading out all these pieces of paper. And there was some amazing stuff in there. There were 3 Nazi passports. You know, old, there's grey, some of you will remember them, there's grey passports with black writing and then gold swastika.
Just briefly interrupt you.
Yeah.
The book has lots of images also of these documents, of pictures you find, which is very interesting because you combine this with your narrative.
Well, I'm a big fan of a writer called W.G. Sebald, and I've always found, Rings of Saturn, that the photographs shouldn't be good quality. It's much better that they are small, black and white, and not high quality. And actually, I mean, I've had thousands of letters and emails about the book, but 1 or 2 people write and say, why couldn't you have put in better quality photographs? And it was a choice, because you have to work to look at a photograph in a W.G. Sebald book and in this book. And so you look at it, and it means you're working, and it means your imagination opens up. It doesn't impose upon you, as a reader, a direct meaning. You're trying to work out what it is. And in fact, I came here also at one point, because I wanted, I think, again, it comes from being in court. I always insist on going to the place that is central in a case that I'm doing, because you feel it differently. If it's a case about a boundary dispute, I want to go to the boundary in the ocean in the Bay of Bengal and see what it's like, or go to Ghana or whatever and see what it's like. If it's a case of mass killing, I want to go and see where it happened, because you immediately relate to it in a completely different way. And so I wanted to come here because what had happened here on the 20th of January 1942, is it in this room?
Probably. We don't know
Yeah.
for sure, but we...
It's sort of amazing to be sitting here, I have to say. It's really amazing seeing... It's the room that's amazing, because what you do is you imagine them looking out on the lake, and then Nina Sillam, my editor, we got into a little elevator, and the thing is, you got in the elevator, and I thought, wow, sort of like Eichmann could have got in this elevator to go upstairs. It's that. So I go to places, and so I need little images and little photographs. And so my mother gave me all of these things, and in the papers, I find a tiny scrap of paper, maybe 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters. There's a photograph of it in the book, and it's just this very straight, strong handwriting in pencil, and it just says, Miss E.M. Tilney, Manuka, Bluebell Road, Norwich, Angleterre. And I say to my mother, what's this? Why have you kept it? Why did someone keep this? She says, I don't know. And it was really that she didn't want to know. She didn't want to open the door. But she did sort of, or she wouldn't have given it to me. That was the thing, because she could have said, no, there's nothing, and then there wouldn't have been a book. I said that to her the other day, and it was really sweet. She was really touched. She had not thought about it like that. But that act of giving, of opening up, meant that this could be done. So I took the piece of paper, stuck it on my desk in my office at home, and vaguely started searching. And it took 4 years to find out who Miss Tilney was, and I did discover with absolute certainty who it was. She had never told a single member of her own family what she had done. Curiously, one of her remaining family members, who now lives in Coconut Grove, Miami, called Germaine, said to me at one point in one of our early telephone conversations after I told her the story, she said, that's really interesting. She said, and I share this you understand the spirit in which I say this. She said, it was really interesting. We knew she hated Germans, but we didn't know why. And it turned out that she was an evangelical missionary who had, in 1920, at the age of 27, gone on mission to North Africa to bring Jews and Muslims to Jesus, apparently very unsuccessfully. No records in the archives of any success, as far as we could tell. The wonderful archivist of the chapel, which exists today and which I still know. And to get from Norwich to North Africa, Algeria, you had to travel by train and through France, and she got to know Paris very well and spent time in Paris. And then at some point in early 1939, she will have met my grandfather in a church in the 8th arrondissement, and he will have said to her, I have a 9-month-old daughter in Paris, would you go and get her? And she went and got her. In Vienna. They were in Paris, and she's in Vienna, and they went and got her. And this, of course, opened up a whole family mystery, which is another heart of the book. I learnt that, contrary to what I had imagined, that they had all travelled to Paris together in 1939, they had travelled separately. My grandfather left by himself in January 1939. My mother followed by herself, aged 1. How does a 1-year-old get from Vienna to Paris by herself in July 1939? And my grandmother stayed behind. So that was a story, because as a parent, and even more so I think for a mother to separate from your 1-year-old child is a really big deal. Something must have happened. So I wanted to find out what had happened. And one moral of the story is, if you are going to have an affair with somebody, do not exclude the possibility that 70 years later or 80 years later, one of your grandchild will find out about it with absolute precision and get to know the grandchildren of the person that you had the affair with. And I discovered the reason that my grandmother stayed behind and the conflict in the relationship between my grandmother and my grandfather, which lasted their whole life, because my brother and I knew that there was a problem, but they had stayed together after the war. And my grandmother stayed behind. The key to unlocking that mystery was actually a letter that my mother had separated out. You shouldn't reveal too much. No, but I will say this, and only gave me later, which was written by a man who signed off as a Seelenarzt, a quack doctor. And I went, of course, it was written in Old German. He claimed to be performing some sort of psychoanalytical function on my grandparents. And my German is terrible, and this was Old German, so I sent it out to 5 German-speaking friends. It was really an interesting exercise. What did this mean? And all of them came back with a different interpretation of what this meant. It was really fascinating. I set out in the book, one psychologist thought it meant this, another psychologist thought it meant that, the school teacher, my children's school, thought it meant this, and then the best of all, I have the great fortune of having, as one of my neighbours, the writer John le Carré. So I went to him. He has a facility. He speaks German really well. He got the Goethe Prize a few years ago, and he loves Germany. And we spent hours trying to decipher what it meant. And I set out all the results, and you'll form your own views. You know, I'm very excited to the reaction in Germany, because it'll be a different reaction. But the upshot was they'd all had affairs. My grandfather, I won't give it away, had the most surprising affair of all, or love story of all, which I sort of and do really love. And it just left me feeling immense gratitude to Miss Tilney, who it turns out was motivated to do her good deeds, which continued after she'd saved my mother. She ends up getting locked up in Stalag 127 in Vittel for 4.5 years, during which time she performs further extraordinary, heroic deeds. But all of her actions are motivated by a single line in chapter 10, verse 1 of Paul's letter to the Romans, a sort of weird interpretation of a single line. I won't give it all away, you can read it, but sort of the theme, a theme through the book is that we all write and read words and we will interpret them in different ways and they will cause us to respond and react differently. And that's sort of fascinating to me and brings back the whole story to the world that I occupy on a daily basis, which is the world of law, where words really matter and where interpretations of words are contested and have very significant consequences. But Miss Tilney is one of the many fabulous characters that I meet. I want to give you one other anecdote, just because it's one of my favorite anecdotes, and it relates to Berlin, since we're in Berlin, and fabulous characters. So I was really curious to speak to people who'd been in the Nuremberg courtroom at the trial, and there are very few left alive, but there are 4 or 5, all remarkable individuals, and you met some of them actually. We performed the thing that we're doing on Monday night in the Nuremberg courtroom, which was astonishing, truly astonishing. And there they were, sitting in the front row, although actually it has to be said, all in their 90s and periodically falling asleep in the front row and having their wives, sort of shake them. But one of them is a French-Swiss man called Yves Begbeder, who devoted his life subsequently to be a civil servant at the United Nations, who was 21 in the summer of 1945 when his uncle, Henri Donnedieu de Vabre, the French judge at Nuremberg, gets in touch through his wife, Yves' aunt, and says, I'm going to Nuremberg. I have the right to have an assistant. Would you like to come and work with me? The guy's 21 years old, and he says, no. Actually, it'd be really boring. I want to go on holiday with my friends for the summer. But he's prevailed upon to change his mind, a life-changing moment. And he spends most of that year in Nuremberg at the trial and watches the whole thing and is there for many of the big moments and tells extraordinary stories of what it was like, although he's very humble about his own role and what he saw. Then at one point I said to him, what about your uncle's relationship with Hans Frank? There's silence on the end of the telephone. He just doesn't say anything. I said, sorry, Yves, did you hear what I said? He said, yes, I heard what you said, but I don't know what you mean. So I said, well, what about the fact that 10 years before the trial, in 1935, your uncle, who was a professor of criminal law at the Sorbonne in Paris, receives an invitation from Hans Frank in his capacity as president of the Deutsche Akademie für Recht to deliver a lecture at a congress organized by Frank here in Berlin. And your uncle accepted. And he went to Berlin. And he gave a lecture on the need for an international criminal court. And Frank responded and said, it's a ridiculous idea and it will never happen, which is sort of ironic. And then 10 years later, and I've often thought about this, the door opens on the morning of the 20th of November 1945, and Frank is there in the dock, and the judges come in, and there's Donnedieu de Vabre, who is going to judge Hans Frank, whom he has not only accepted an invitation from 10 years earlier, but has delivered a lecture for, and has then had dinner with Frank and a gentleman by the name of Julius Streicher later that evening. So in my world of law, once you have a personal connection, whether you are counsel or judge, you are out of the case. You cannot participate. So I tell this whole story to Eve, and he says, no, it cannot be true. I know nothing about this. He's really lost for words. He says, how do you know? I said, would you like me to send you the speech and a photograph of your uncle in Berlin delivering the lecture? It's in the book. He said, please, I've never heard anything. So I sent it all to him, but I also told him that this too has consequences. I found the personal papers of the American judge at Nuremberg, Francis Biddle, which are kept in an archive at Syracuse University in the United States. All of his personal papers during the trial, including the deliberations in relation to what to do with each of the defendants. And they're mostly typed out, but at one point, Biddle writes in his own hand, Donnedieu de Vabre, curiously tender towards Frank, which of course I immediately understand from my own experience in a courtroom, which is, it's very difficult to hang someone you've had a meal with, which is why you don't sit on a case where you've come to know someone. But again, what the book tries to do is explain that the way our books talk about how law works and how courts and tribunals works is, of course, not wrong, but it's not complete. There is always the intervention of the human being as judge, as counsel, as defendant, as Miss Tilney. And in a sense, it's a subtle way of saying individuals really matter. Individuals really make a difference. And however much I understand Lemkin's thesis and support it, the word genocide exists and will not disappear now, Lauterpacht settled, I think, on an essential truth that every individual is different and makes a difference in their own way. And it's that idea, I think, for me, that is really at the heart of the book.
Philippe, thank you very much. So it all comes back to the Bible and to coincidence and to individuals. Yeah.